Welcome to a deep dive into, well, a topic you all chose, the Giantess. We've got your research document right here, Understanding the Giantess, and wow, it is packed with some really interesting stuff. I am excited to dig into this with you.
What really gets me about the Giantess is how it kind of turns those classic giant tropes on their head.
Right.
You know, like the big bad giant causing mayhem. The Giantess she adds something totally new.
Absolutely. We often see those giants depicted as big, bad, and honestly mostly male figures.
Right?
But the Giantess, she kind of like throws those traditional gender roles out the window, doesn't she?
Yeah.
What is it about how she's portrayed that makes her so different? What are the things that really make her stand out?
It's like, instead of just being all about raw power, the Giantess, a lot of times she's this really interesting mix of strength and empathy.
Okay.
You know, like, imagine a being who could crush a city block without even noticing, but then, like, carefully shelters a wounded bird in her hand.
Oh, wow.
That unexpected tenderness, I think, can really make you stop and question things.
It really makes you rethink what powerful even means. Like, it's not just about being physically dominant anymore. It's so much more complex than that.
Totally. And that complexity, I think, is what makes her such a great fit for all different types of genres, you know?
Oh, yeah.
We see her in adventure stories, romances, even horror.
Speaking of different genres, did the document give any specific examples of how a genre can actually change the way a giantess is shown?
Well, if you think about, say, a romance story, the Giantess might be this, like, ultimate powerful female figure, right?
Yeah.
Someone who could sweep you off your feet, literally.
Yeah.
But, like, in a horror story, that same huge size could become something terrifying.
Yes, of course.
Suddenly you feel totally helpless because she has so much power. It's interesting, right? How that context can totally change how we see her.
Yeah, wow. I'd never really thought about it that way before.
Yeah.
This whole idea of perspective seems to be a big deal in giantess stories. What's it like trying to step into the shoes of both the giantess and, the tiny character interacting with her?
Okay, so imagine being the Giantess for a sec.
Okay.
You are massive, looking down on everything.
Right.
You experience the world on this massive scale that most of us can't even fathom. But, and this is a big but,
Yeah.
think about the other side of that, how lonely it might feel to be that different.
Right. Yeah.
You might really crave connection, but just have a hard time finding someone who can see past your literal size.
That's not something I'd really considered before. It's easy to focus on just the sheer scale of it and forget about the potential emotional side.
Totally. And then flip the script and imagine you're that tiny character.
Okay.
You'd be aware of how vulnerable you are constantly, right?
Yeah.
Like how easily you could be crushed.
Oh, yeah.
Every interaction then becomes really risky because you have to trust her completely.
You realize that the whole who has the power thing is way more complicated than just being physically stronger, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, just having a giantess and a tiny character automatically means there's this power imbalance.
Right.
But it's how they handle that, how trust and fear and even like affection play into it all. That's what makes it really interesting.
So we've got the contrast in how they each see the world. But the document also talked about different types of giantess characters, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a one-size-fits-all situation, pun intended.
Right.
What are some of the different ones we might see?
Yeah, you're right. There are a bunch of different giantess archetypes, each with their own way of dealing with that power dynamic we were just talking about. You've got your gentle giantesses, the ones who are all about using their strength to protect people and take care of them, almost like...
Like gentle giants.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like a walking, talking fortress, but with a heart of gold.
Makes me think of those classic fairy tales, where a giantess might help a lost child or even a whole village. There's something so safe and wondrous about that.
Right. But then you have the opposite end of that spectrum. You've got the more, what's the word, domineering ones. They really revel in their power over others, maybe even like seeing how much they can make people respect them.
Oh, okay. So a totally different vibe then.
Yeah. And then there's...
I think the document actually used the phrase, like, toying with power to describe one of the giantess types. What do they mean by that?
Oh, right. Yeah. That would be the playful giantess.
Okay.
She's not as focused on outright controlling everything and more about, well, playing with the world around her. Think like setting up these elaborate games or challenges. They seem fun on the surface, but there's always that reminder of who's really in charge.
Wow. It's crazy how much variation there can be within one character type. And the document really seemed to stress that there's still so much untapped potential when it comes to giantess stories, don't you think?
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole topic so interesting.
Yeah.
We've barely scratched the surface of what we can do with these stories.
It sounds like we need to think beyond just those simple, one-dimensional depictions and really dig into everything that the Giantess has to offer.
I agree.
But before we get into that, I'm really curious to look more closely at how the actual size difference impacts these stories.
Definitely. That's huge.
Yeah.
The document actually pointed out how even a small difference in scale can completely change the story and how it makes you feel. We should unpack that. It's easy to get stuck on, like, the image of a giantess towering over skyscrapers and stuff.
Right.
But even a giantess who's, say, 12 feet tall, that still creates a pretty intense dynamic,
That's a really good point. It's not always about being absolutely huge. It's more about how that size difference, whatever it is, how it changes how they relate to each other.
Right.
Did the document have any specific examples of that?
Yeah, it talked about how when the size difference is smaller, it can lead to these really interesting explorations of intimacy
Oh, interesting.
and vulnerability.
I see what you mean.
Like, imagine a giantess who has to be super careful not to hurt you, even with just a touch.
Yeah.
That creates a whole different kind of tension, right?
It really does. It's like you go from feeling tiny and insignificant to realizing how delicate you are to her.
All right.
And suddenly there's this like new layer of emotion there.
For sure.
What about how the giantess herself is actually presented? Like what she's wearing, how she acts, that must play a part too, right?
Totally. The document actually made a point of saying that a giantess's clothes, her mannerisms, even her voice, it can all really affect how we see her.
Right.
Like a giantess in flowing silk robes, she's going to give you a completely different vibe than one who's dressed in, like, full armor,
Oh, for sure. It's like 1 minute you're picturing a graceful, almost goddess-like figure, and the next it's a powerful warrior queen.
Exactly.
And they're both strong, but the way they present themselves hints at totally different relationships to that power.
Yeah.
It's so cool how these little details can change everything.
And it all circles back to those archetypes we were talking about before, too.
Right.
Like a gentle giantess, she might have a really soothing voice, very melodic, while a domineering one might have this booming laugh that practically shakes the ground when you hear it.
Oh, wow. I'm getting chills just picturing that. It's incredible how these little details make the giantess feel so real, even though she's obviously a fantasy character.
Right.
But, we've been talking a lot about subverting expectations and all. Are there any common traps that writers fall into when they're trying to create giantess stories?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And yeah, the document actually mentioned a few.
Oh, okay.
One of the big ones is falling back on those, like, really basic one-dimensional portrayals that we've been talking about. Like,
Right.
just because you make a character big and strong doesn't mean they're automatically interesting.
Oh, it's like any other character. They need to have depth, motivations, flaws, all the things that make them relatable.
Yeah.
Even if they're, literally larger than life.
Exactly. Another trap is forgetting that the giantess is a whole person, too.
Oh, right. Of course.
Yeah. Like, what are her hopes and dreams? What are her fears?
Yeah.
Just because she's physically imposing doesn't mean she doesn't have a rich inner life, right?
Absolutely. It reminds me of how the document talked about some giantesses feeling really lonely.
Yeah.
That feeling of being isolated, of not being able to really connect with other people.
Right.
That's something that I think everyone has felt at some point,
Exactly.
It doesn't matter how big or small you are.
And that's what makes the giantess such a powerful character for exploring themes of connection and vulnerability, that search for belonging.
Right.
But, it takes a really skilled storyteller to really dig into those deeper layers.
So how do we make sure we're doing that? Like, as creators, or even just as people who enjoy these kinds of stories, how do we avoid those pitfalls? How do we do justice to the giantess as a character?
Well, the document had this really interesting call to action.
Oh, yeah.
It basically challenged us to ask ourselves some tough questions, like, what stories about giantesses haven't been told yet?
Yeah.
How can we use this trope to really flip those gender stereotypes on their head
Right.
and explore totally new ideas about power?
I like that.
How can we create giantess characters that are more than just, their physical size?
It's like we need to look past what's obvious
Yeah.
and really wrestle with the potential that's there with the giantess.
Yeah, I think so.
It's definitely a challenge, but an exciting one. Right.
For sure.
Where do we go from here? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think for me, it's all about accepting that challenge, being willing to ask those tough questions and push the boundaries a
I
little.
like that.
It's about seeing the giantess not just as this, like, fantasy figure, but as this reflection of our own humanity.
And as a reminder that even the most fantastical stories, they can still have these really deep, profound truths to them.
Exactly.
It's been amazing talking about this with you. This deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel like I have this whole new understanding of the giantess now.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, for sure. But before we wrap up, I have one final question for you and for all our listeners.
Yeah.
How can you take what we talked about today and use it in your own creative work, or even just in the way you see the world?
Ooh, that's a great question to leave everyone with. We'd love to hear what you all come up with.
So we've talked about all these different aspects of the giantess, but
Yeah.
how do we actually put it all together? Like, how do we, as the document puts it, move beyond those one-dimensional portrayals
Yeah.
and really get to that, multifaceted character?
I think it really starts with remembering that a giantess is so much more than just her size, you know?
Right?
It's about digging deeper, like what motivates her? What does she want? What are her flaws? Just like with any good character, you've got to give her some depth, make her feel real.
And that's where those different archetypes are so helpful, right?
Exactly.
We've talked about the gentle giantess, the
Yeah.
domineering giantess, the playful giantess, and they each show us a completely different side of power and relationships and just like how they exist in the world.
Exactly. And even within those archetypes, there's still so much room to explore.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What about a giantess who's like torn between wanting to protect everyone and craving freedom?
Oh, wow.
Or one who uses her size to like challenge the way things are and fight for people who are usually ignored?
That's such a cool idea.
Right.
It's like we need to give them agency. Let them be the heroes of their own stories, not just these like figures of awe or fear in someone else's story,
Totally.
The document really stresses how important it is to challenge our assumptions. Like, what if a giantess's greatest strength isn't her physical power at all, but her compassion
Right.
or her wisdom?
Those are the kinds of questions that lead to really incredible, groundbreaking stories that really make you think, you know?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the giantess, with all her coterie and stuff, she reflects something really human in all of us.
That's so true.
Yeah. That desire to connect with people, that struggle to figure out where we fit in, that feeling of being strong and vulnerable at the same time, you know?
Fully.
I think if we can tap into those universal themes, we can create giantess stories that are both like entertaining and thought-provoking, stories that really stick with you.
It's about using the giantess as this like lens to examine ourselves and the world around us, isn't it?
Exactly.
Wow. That is a powerful message to end on. This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I have this whole new perspective on the giantess now.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah, it really has. And I hope this inspires everyone listening to, look for those more nuanced portrayals of giantesses out there. Question the stories you encounter and maybe even create some of your own.
Yeah.
Because there's so many possibilities just waiting to be explored.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And remember, the best stories are often the ones that make us think differently.